Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a virtual training webinar hosted by the VA OSDBU and the Strategic Outreach and Communications Program. Please note, all participants will remain muted for the duration of the session. If you experience any connectivity issues while logged in, we suggest disconnecting and logging in again. If that does not resolve your issue, please use the WebEx dial-in and access code to rejoin the session. The session will be recorded, and a copy of the presentation, as well as a link to view the recording, will be made available to you within 48 hours. Please take a moment to locate the Q&A panel and chat window on the lower right side of your screen. Only use the Q&A panel to type in your questions for the panelist, and only use the chat feature for brief networking, introductions, and kudos. At the conclusion of today's event, you will be prompted to complete a brief survey. We greatly appreciate your feedback. Before we begin, I would like to welcome Ms. Avetta Lewis, our Direct Access Program Team Lead, to give opening remarks on behalf of VA OSDBU. Ms. Lewis, welcome.
Thank you, Jessica. Greetings and good afternoon from the Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization. On behalf of our leadership, we thank you for your participation in today's virtual training webinar. VA OSDBU remains committed to employing innovative methods to promptly inform you about relevant procurement opportunities, training, and information. Virtual events we conduct would not be possible without the support of industry partners. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome to our host from Exceed Cybersecurity and Compliance, Mr. Brian Gunther, CISSP and Company President. Strategic Outreach and Communications is dedicated to small business readiness through programs, outreach events, education, and training. We routinely conduct a variety of engaging online events designed to facilitate meaningful interactions and foster relationships. We encourage all to continue to visit our website to stay updated on upcoming events and valuable opportunities to connect and collaborate. We also extend our thanks to everyone who supports the department in its mission to serve our nation's veterans. Mr. Gunther, you may begin.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that, Ms. Lewis. I appreciate the introduction. And I want to say thank you, everyone, for being here today to take a little bit of time out of your afternoon to learn a little bit more about CMMC. And I also want to be sure, and I would be remiss if I did not give a big thank you to the VA's OSDBU team for putting on this event. It means a lot, especially for a veteran-owned business in this community. Today, we'll build on our previous discussion, which was called Unlocking CMMC Success. That was from November 21, 2024. So a very short 5 months ago, which when times were very different. Of course, a lot changes in the 5 months time frame, certainly the CMMC space. I want to apologize also for those who were in attendance. My audio was not very good, and as such, there'll be a little bit of a sort of slight review we're going to do today to make sure that, first of all, we make good on that, but also for anyone who's new, that you do understand some of the very foundational basics of CMMC. We're going to go over that. So as such, informational webinar will take a deeper dive into CMMC compliance strategies for U.S. defense contractors and specifically for small veteran-owned businesses. And CMMC is here to stay. That's something we'll talk about a bit more later. And we'll discuss common compliance pitfalls, key updates to CMMC regulations, and practical steps to strengthen cybersecurity measures and to start your CMMC journey. Now, the attendees, that's you, will gain insight into third-party assessments, implementing security improvements, and how to maintain compliance over time, and how to best prepare for your final certification assessment. So whether you're prepping for an audit or you're refining your approach, this session will equip you with the tools to stay ahead of evolving requirements. So, ready to dive in? I am. All right, let's get going. Okay, so first of all, big disclaimer. The materials provided in this webinar are for general information, education purposes only. The materials are not intended to be and should not be considered legal advice or opinions that are binding. No client relationship is formed by attending this webinar, and you should not act upon any information represented in this first without seeking legal counsel on your specific matter or any kind of technical advice. Attending this briefing does not guarantee or promise a successful assessment or accreditation for the CMMC program. And this presentation is being recorded. All right, let's go ahead and jump right in. and into the first slide here. So high level agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the CMMC basics. Like I said, a bit of an update from last fall. What's new? Final rule, world impacts, real world impacts, how this affects you as veteran-owned businesses, practical steps for small businesses. We're going to talk a little bit more about what it takes and what you can engage in to get the most out of this program and how you can actually monetize this, right? We'll talk about some common misconceptions and pitfalls, some things that people tend to believe, think about, or maybe the rumors going around there's a big rumor mill going on out there. So we'll try to dispel some of those myths as well. And what you can do today to get started in this process. I have some resources for you closer to the end of the presentation. And as Ms. Lewis said just a minute ago, if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A. We do have time for Q&A at the end of the meeting today. We'll talk about that then. I'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation until we reach the top of the hour, half top of the hour, excuse me, which will be 2:30 p.m. Eastern time here. And we'll go ahead and get started. So jumping right in. All right, like I said, a quick refresher on CMMC, the basics, the primer, if you will. So first of all, what is CMMC? For those of you who are brand new, you probably know, you can read it on screen, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And the part that we're going to talk about a bit more later and with more of a heavy emphasis is the certification aspect of this cybersecurity journey. Okay, so why does this matter for small and veteran-owned businesses? Well, the reason is many of them are quite small and there's a significant impact to their businesses, which, believe me, is not lost on the DoD nor the ecosystem, the CMMC ecosystem. We know it's complicated, and we're here to try to dispel some of the myths and hopefully create some clarity for you. Why do we have CMMC? And where did it come from? I'll talk about in the next slide a little bit. That's where we talk about the CMMC, kind of the roadmap, where it all came from. I call it a brief CMMC history. And are the requirements new? Well, the requirements are actually not new. So the requirements actually came from a regulation, long form DFARS 252-204-7012. For those policy and regulatory wonks among us, you'll know what that means. If you're a contracting officer, you know what that means. But essentially, it's abbreviated as DFARS 7012. How does that compare to CMMC? Well, talk about that in the next slide too. And I want to make sure I say this and I anchor this with you right now. This will cost you money. Unless you've already gone down the road and done some serious work around this and implement your policies, your processes, and lifted up your systems entirely to where you can actually safeguard the government's data, there's going to be a pretty significant investment, and we're going to talk about that. All right, getting to the next slide here. Bear with me for a second. All right, let's talk about the history of CMMC. In 2001, we had the unfortunate the terrorist attacks on US soil, September 11th. That led to a years-long, about a 2.5-year-long congressional investigation. In 2004, that 9/11 Commission report was published. That Commission report indicated very clearly in no uncertain terms one of the reasons that the impact of 9/11 was able to be so widespread and far-reaching was because there was actually fairly little communication and interchange and communication exchange between different departments and agencies. So one of the things that came out of that was the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which reorganized a lot of the federal government under one banner. For example, FBI, ICE, and Customs Border Protection, a lot of different agencies that were smaller reorganized under Department of Homeland Security to help better communicate and exchange and share information between those agencies. So in 2005, between 2005 and 2009, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, what's called NIST for short, as part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, published what was called NIST Special Publication 800-53. Now that's a mouthful, but really what that means is a massive framework that effectively provided guidance for the US government, for its agencies to safeguard its information systems from the wrong people effectively, right? So this consists of several hundred what are called policies and procedures and security practices to make sure that government systems are locked down and controlled, and only those who are allowed to have access to the systems, okay? That's a very broad description, so forgive me, but I'll kind of stop there. You'll see below that on the second bullet, it says SP 800-171. Well, what does that mean? Well, that is a subset of NIST 853. 800-171 is, again, another special publication that is specifically tailored to and defined as safeguarding controlled unclassified information, or CUI, on non-federal systems. To be clear, I'll emphasize non-federal systems. So those are computers that are under the purview and control of DoD contractors. Okay? That was a pretty major shift that happened, or that took place. Then in 2010, the president signed an executive order defining controlled unclassified classified information, what it is, what it applies to, who has to adhere to it, and that was released at that point. Now, accelerating a little bit, fast forwarding here to 2016, it was a finalization of the mandate called DFARS 7012. I mentioned that before. And DFARS 7012 is, quite frankly, just an abbreviation for the part 2 bullets to the left, NIST 800-171. All those components, if you're a defense contractor, must be implemented, and there's 110 what are called controls or practices, need to be implemented on non-federal systems. Again, those are your networks to safeguard FCI, federal contract information, and specifically CUI, controlled unclassified information. Okay? That was published at that point, and that meant all DoD contractors under regulation, which is an extension of law, must now adhere to this new regulation and have to implement this. Well, there was a problem with this. The problem was there was no enforcement. There was no attestation. It was all really based on the honor system. And what happened now in 2018, 2019, that time frame, DoD put out and sent out inspector generals into the field, and those inspector generals were then investigating to see did a spot check, think of it that way, to identify how many defense contractors actually implemented this. And what was shocking was an overwhelming number, I believe it was over 90%, had either never heard of it, maybe had started it, or not done anything. Okay. So they reported back to the bosses at the DoD, or at the DoD CIO, the ISSO, the CISO, and said, look, this really isn't working. We have to do something else. This was the birth of CMMC. Around 2018, 2019 is when it started, okay? That's when they started establishing the CMMC initiative, because they realized this regulation was not being implemented because it really had no teeth, had no controls around it. What are we going to do? Well, we need to start working on a process by which we make sure that our defense contractor, our defense supply chain, again, the DSC, or the defense industrial base, adheres to these regulations. Well, that kicked off about a 5 to 6 year journey, at which we're currently at the end of that process. So nothing moves slow, moves quickly rather. It's kind of like turning the Titanic, right? The federal government's huge. The DoD is huge. Takes a long time to go through this. Regulation takes time to develop. A lot of people have input. There's a lot of feedback. It's sort of a very iterative but slow process. So in 2020 to 2024 is when this process was building. Then finally, this past December 16, 2024, the final rule for what's called 32 CFR Part 170, which is the ecosystem, the CMMC ecosystem going live, that launched at this point, okay? And that is now fully live and, if you will, enforceable. The part that's missing, however, and this is what we expect to happen in probably Q3, probably not Q2, but Q3, is the inclusion of CMMC regulation requirements within DoD contracts, okay? The inclusion of the DoD contracts is the last piece that we expect to see happen again sometime middle of the year this year. I know that's a lot, but at least you now have the history. If you were in the previous one, you've heard this before, but now you have a foundational, where did this come from? Why do we even have this? And it's about making sure CMMC is really not the thing you have to do. CMMC is affirming and attesting and complying with what you're already supposed to have done as a DoD contractor, as a defense contractor in the supply chain. All right. So just be aware, and I see a lot of messages popping up in the chat on the right hand side in the Q&A. But be aware that the Q&A will come back to that later when we get a chance in the meeting. We'll have some time for that. All right, moving right along here. There are 3 different levels of maturity that defense contractors may have to meet, and I'll tell you what those are. Every defense contractor, whether you're prime or a sub to a sub, you have to meet maturity level 1. This is what's called foundational. It's only 17 practices, which are no policies and no written processes have to be written, but they're mostly technical in nature, technical protection and controls that make sure you're safeguarding only federal contract information, or FCI. Again, each defense contractor has to do this. Nobody is exempted at a bare minimum, okay? So level 1 is required for everybody. Level 2, maturity level 2, this where it gets a little bit deeper. We talked about CUI before, controlled unclassified information, must be safeguarded, okay? The DoD, and you'll hear me say this more than once during this presentation, is extremely serious about this. This is not a joke. It is not trying to make life hard for anybody. It's not intentionally trying to make your life hard, but it's in order to protect our global competitive standing as well as our national security. If you're familiar, you've probably heard about the F-22 and the F-35, F-35 Joint Strike Fighter situation where those programs were wholesale stolen from the federal government, okay? And they were taken by, I won't name names, but let's say a relatively adversarial nation state, and those weapon systems, those fighter jets, were rebuilt on foreign soil without our awareness or our knowledge, okay? That is a major embarrassment to the DoD, and they really want to avoid that. You can understand why, right? There have been other lapses in security and where data has been exfiltrated or stolen by nation states or other parties that are unauthorized. So bear in mind when these things are happening, they're not happening in a vacuum. They're happening for a reason, okay? So that context is actually really important because, again, they're not trying to be unfair towards small business owners, even though it may feel that way. And we'll talk about that a bit more later. So maturity level 2, it's estimated about 30 to 35% of defense supply chain contractors will need to meet that. I'll pause there for a second and say it's entirely possible that you, as being part of a supply chain, whether a prime or downstream from a prime, right? What's called the flow down rule, that you've already heard about this. You may have even been contacted by your upstream, right? By your prime or by an upstream sub about implementing this. So this shouldn't be new. It certainly hasn't, it's been around and being talked about for a while. I think a lot of people are waiting on the sidelines, just sort of hanging out and waiting for it to happen. Well, it's here. And so now things need to really get moving. So maturity level 2 has to protect 110 practices to safeguard CUI. Again, estimated about 30 to 35% of the defense industrial base to whom this will apply. Level 3 is a higher component that can only be assessed by what's called the DIBCAC. You know the DoD likes to acronymize. It's the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center. This is a bolt-on Lego, if you look at the diagram, that's on top of level 2. So level 1 is a self-attestation where you can do it yourself. That doesn't require a third party. Level 2, what we'll talk about, does require a third party to assess you, give you attestation and accreditation. And then level 3 is done on top of that third party assessment. And then that level 3 certification, that's done by the DIBCAC, which is, again, the DoD Cybersecurity Assessment Center. Okay? So these are all relevant pieces. There's more detail to it, but from a high level, I want to make sure we cover this again. Bear with me for 1 second here. All right. So what's new in the final rule? Like I said, it was published in December 2024. It updated the level 2 requirements. Now, again, it's 110 controls to safeguard CUI. Now, if you, and this should resonate with you, if you're an owner in this business, if you store, process, or transmit CUI, you must safeguard it. All right. Now, when you get assessed at the end of the road, when you have a final assessments, you cannot have what's called a plan of action and milestones to get your final certification. You can get an interim certification by a certified third-party assessor. If you look one line down, it says who needs a 3PAO assessment. It says a third-party assessment organization. These are third parties that are like auditors, and they come in and say, all right, you say you've like set yourself up and you've leveled up your security practices, your policies, your procedures, and you can have us come in, the third-party assessment, that's not us, that's another party, and then certify you and say, all right, did you actually do all the things you need to do to safeguard this CUI? That's what the DoD cares about. And those certified third-party assessors, what are called CCAs, certified CMMC assessors, those men and women are actually literally agents of the DoD. They're literally sworn as agents of the DoD, and they have the capability of now certifying you as a defense contractor, right, in that supply chain. Did you do what you need to do? And you cannot have what's called a plan of action of milestones where things are kind of unresolved in the end. You get sort of one mulligan, one do-over at your first assessment, and then at 6 weeks later, you can then say, all right, we've closed all those gaps, and we can now be assessed again. Now you get your final certification. It's good for 3 years. That certification is good for 3 years. But every year, you or the owner in your company will have to attest on the penalty of perjury that all the things that were done are still being done and that you're maintaining that level of compliance. So it's not just leveling up, it's maintaining over 3 years, and then you get assessed again. Okay? All right. So I also want to clarify something. CUI does not mean classified. Classified data may not live on non-federal systems, only on federal systems, whether it's in an Army base, whether it's in a SCIF, or wherever that may be, wherever that information is allowed to be exchanged. But the information is still considered sensitive. And CUI is really, again, those contract folks among us here will have heard these terms before, is an umbrella construct, right? Think of it. Controlled unclassified information could be several types of data. For example, ITAR is a very high level of CUI, considered international trade and arms regulation. That's a very high level of CUI, or no foreign eyes on this document, for example, right? Those are just examples of what CUI may be. There are various types of it. It's not all CUI is the same, all right? And this is not a class in CUI, because you don't want me teaching that part of it. But I want to be sure that you understand that CUI does not mean classified, it just means sensitive, and that the DoD makes you protected. All right. So the 3-year contract rollout is expected to begin this summer. That's where I talked about before, this 48 CFR, and I have a slide that's following this, and I'll talk about what that looks like. Also, CMMC is here to stay. For those of you who are hoping, wishing that it's just going to go away and die, that's not going to happen, and here's why. This program was started under the first Trump term. It continued under the Biden term. It's now continuing under the second Trump administration, right? So it's moving forward. It's in no way a political statement, by the way. I'm not trying to do that. However, you need to know that it's not going away. There's no reason to think that, because it's continuing. And it was actually Katie Arrington, who's the DoD CIO. She's one who said this in the last couple of months. This is literally a quote from her. Further, Katie Arrington was actually one of the chief architects behind CMMC. So if you're hoping this goes away, that you don't have to pay the money to kind of level up, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. It is here to stay, because it's a matter of national interest and national security. All right, moving right along. So this is the rollout of the CMMC schedule. 1 CFR for 48 CFR, we talked about that before. 48 CFR is the part that hasn't passed yet. We expect it to pass this summer. That's where that part becomes regulation, and that means that CMMC and the requirements around it are included in defense contracts. They go to your prime, and the prime flows them down to you as a sub, if you're a sub, and then flow down further to subcontractors there. And it's what's called a flow down requirement. By law, all regulation flows down to the bottom of the rung, if you will, okay? And what this illustrates, that during year 1, 2, and 3, during the four phases of the rollout, that different phases of this process, or this roadmap, will be rolled out, okay? Feel free to grab a screenshot here. This might not be a bad idea, because this is a really good slide. Sort of roughly tells you what to expect and where things are going and coming in, okay? But I want you to understand that that's why the footer is in there. In some procurements, DoD may implement CMMC requirements in advance of the planned phase. We're already seeing that. Okay, we're already seeing requirements coming in where DFAR 7012, the existing regulation, is already in contracts and already has been. Okay, now to be very clear, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give you legal advice, and I'm not a contracting officer. I'm not a CO. I'm not a co-chair, I'm not a CO. However, you should know we've seen this with clients we've worked with. Okay, I urge you, and this is in a slide later, to go back and look at your own contracts. Look very clearly at clauses where there's inclusion by reference. I want you to make sure that you do that, that you understand what your requirements are contractually, because that's really the only thing you can be held to if it's in the contract, okay? And the contract is an extension of regulation, which is tied to law. So keep all those pieces in mind. All right, 1 minute, please. So common misconceptions and pitfalls that you need to understand about CMMC. We're too small to be targeted. You can look at this in a variety of different ways. One of which is, we're not going to have anyone steal data from us. But I'll ask you this question. Do you really want to take that chance? Are you confident that you're impenetrable, that your systems are that good, your protections are that good? You might be, But it's not just about being too small to be targeted by the bad guys. It's also too small to be targeted for an audit. Right? The DoD comes in, or that your prime or sub above you comes in and audits you. Right? We'll talk about the risks and opportunities in the next slide, but I want to make sure I mention that. So just because you're too small, maybe because you're 3, 5, 10, 20, 30 people, doesn't mean you're too small for this. Everybody has to adhere. The next one is we can wait till it's in our contract. I will tell you that you probably can't afford to do that. We'll get into that more a little bit later, but waiting until that's done, until you start rolling out these controls and these practices that are a long runway, will put you at a distinct disadvantage in the marketplace. I would not recommend it. Third bullet, my IT company or managed service provider, managed IT service providers handling everything. This is something that, being in this industry, we have heard time and time again. It's a mistaken belief that my quote IT guy or IT person, IT company, that they're taking care of everything I think they're taking care of. And sadly, that couldn't be further from the truth. That's just not the case. I would encourage you, if you believe that, to have a conversation with them and ask them, what are you doing about CMMC for my business? I would be very surprised if they said, we have you all dialed in, because that would be extremely unusual, and it'd be totally out of scope. By the way, compliance work is not within scope from IT work. And those are inherently very different things. So make sure you're having conversations with your IT, either team, outsourced provider, or managed service provider. Talk to them about that, right? Get them engaged. Have a conversation now. Also, believing this is just an IT project, it is not. CMMC is only 30% technical, especially for maturity level 2 or higher. The remainder is policies, process, documentation, evidence collection, asset inventory, diagrams, network diagrams, workflow diagrams. It is a ton of stuff. And it's, the concept of drinking from a fire hose. Once you start looking at it, you're like, oh my God, this is insane. I don't realize how big this is. We get that comment every time we work with a new client. They just think it's no big deal until they realize it is a big deal, and it's a big process. I don't say that to scare you. I say that to set expectations. Okay, CMMC is all about technology. Again, it's not. It's mostly about non-technical components, people issues, security issues, physical access controls, documentation, policies, procedures, and so on. The belief that you can assess yourself. In maturity level 1, technically you can, because you only have to do 17 practices. That does not require third-party assessment, and it does not require any policies or procedures in maturity level 1, because you're only safeguarding FCI, the contract information, right? That is still important, and there's still pieces that are needed there, but you don't need policies and procedures, so it makes it less complicated and much smaller, okay? So let's talk for a second about the cost to become compliant. A lot of numbers are floating around out there, a lot. And I love creating clarity. For me, communication is the biggest and most important thing. And there's a great phrase, a term that I like to use by George Bernard Shaw, which is communication is the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that has taken place. And so you can hear something from someone or have a communication with someone, but you understand different things. And sometimes information you're given is just plainly, it's either, it's a rumor, it maybe is a half truth, or maybe it's flat out wrong. And therefore finding authoritative information and data is so critical. And I always encourage people to do your own insight, your own investigation to make sure you're doing the right thing for you and your company and your people. Don't leave this to chance, okay? The cost to become compliant range for maturity level 1. I would say, again, you can mostly do that yourself with your IT provider. For the most part, that should be possible. Somewhere between $20,000 to $30,000 where you can expect to invest in that to level you up, to do your self-assessment and your attestation. Maturity level 2 is a far different situation. The estimates are between $100,000 to $150,000 from start if you've done nothing to getting yourself assessed to finishing through the assessment. 100 to 150, I want to make sure I anchor that number in your head. And I know it's going to be sticker shock for a lot of you, but you need to hear it because that's what it's going to take to get you there. It may feel unfair. If you're feeling that right now, I hear you. It may feel unfair, like why should we have to pay that? We can't do that. We're too small. You can't pay it. But what you have to understand is if you're guarding CUI and you have CUI in your organization, you store, process, or transmit CUI, there really is not a choice. Again, I'm just the messenger here. You can't not do this and expect to work at the DoD. I'll talk about the False Claims Act in a minute and what that means. Okay, so expect that if you have CUI in your environment, and you probably know that you do, and if you do have that, you're looking about $100,000 to $150,000 investment to level yourself up to where you can get assessed. Okay. All right. A lot of us here are going to be business owners. So let's talk about the business case for CMMC. What are the cons? What are the pros? You see way at the bottom, it says stick or carrot. And I'll talk about why I say that. So first of all, the risks. The existing risks, existing DFARS requirements are already here today. They're already present. It's just not being enforced. But you have to understand, you already have to have done these things. The fact that you didn't do them, and I'm not saying you did or didn't do them, but if it's you and you didn't do it, is immaterial. The DoD doesn't really care, right? But this is why they're implementing CMMC, to make sure that you did it and that that's checked by someone else who can essentially say you did it or you didn't, and can feed that back to them, and they know that you're secure, right? That you have that security in place. And so those requirements are already in place today. They exist right now. They've existed for years. Next, do you want to be on the receiving end of an audit and losing your existing contracts, whether it's directly from the Department of Defense or whether it's from your upstream supplier, right? If you're a supplier to them, your upstream subcontractor or the prime. If they audit you, because I can tell you those primes are getting very serious about this, and I know they're pushing communications down through their supply chain to ensure that its subcontractors are adhering to this. This is rolling out. We're hearing it all over the place. So what you don't want to be on the receiving end of is losing your contract, unless you really want to get out of the DoD business, and that's fine. And you should know that if you don't want to do this, you can't be in the Department of Defense supply chain. It's simply not possible. You can't do that. Okay. Next thing, bullet 3 here, False Claims Act. In the last year ending fiscal year 2024, the DOJ collected almost $3 billion in penalties as far as settlements for False Claims Act lawsuits by the DOJ against defense contractors. Okay. They're going after them and saying, you're breaking the law, regulation is ensconced, you did not take care and take due care to safeguard the DoD's data. They're coming after you, and I don't mean you specifically, but they're coming after businesses that are really flouting the law and ignoring the mandate. Okay. And if that's you, this could be your wake-up call. Hopefully it is, that you don't want to be on a receiving end of a DOJ False Claims Act lawsuit. You don't want to do that. If you want to look up more information, there's a link right there. That's directly at the DOJ website. Okay. And to put a finer point on it, if you're not compliant, you cannot win contracts. You just can't. So once this is rolled out, once this goes into effect in this, again, expected this summer, the last component of CMMC, again, it's inclusion in contracts. Once that 48 CFR is rolled out, you will be unable to win contracts if you yourself are not compliant when that's in your contract from your sub or your prime on down. Okay. Now that's the bad part. Let's talk about good stuff. Let's talk about the good stuff now. There is good stuff. And that is that CMMC gives you, if you go into this early and you take it seriously and you lean in and say, all right, we're going to have to do this because a percentage, 30, 50, 90% of our business is DoD business, and we have to do it. We might as well get going early. If you adopt that mindset, because it really is a mind shift, if you adopt that mindset, you will be able to win more contracts when your colleagues, contemporaries, and competition who do what you do cannot, because they didn't do it, right? There will come a time when there'll be a reduced supply chain because a percentage of them did not comply, completely decide to lean out and say, you know what, we're moving away from DoD, not worth it. We're not going to do it, right? If you do this, the opportunity is far greater. You're going to be a part of a smaller group of companies that can win the contract. Okay. So do you see the opportunity here? If you're one of a fewer qualified subcontractors, that's going to raise your performance. You'll grow your business and your company overall. And that to me is a good thing, right? That's what capitalism is about, is growing your company, your organization, and making the best of it, right? Even with these constraints. And when you get these awards, you grow the business, as I said before. So would you rather be on the receiving end of the stick where you get whacked with the bad stuff and lose contracts or not win new ones? Or would you rather deal with the carrot and say, you know what? I see the value in doing this. Let me be an earlier adopter and get ahead of this. And then that way you grow your business more quickly. Okay. Not trying to be doomsday and naysayer here, or try to preach doomsday. It's not about that, but it's really about clear, concise, and actionable information. You need to know this. You need to make good decisions with the information you can get. Please feel free to check me, right? I don't think I'm wrong, but feel free to check this information from other sources. All right, coming near the end of the presentation here, a couple more things, some practical steps. Bear with me. All right, so you want to identify if you handle CUI or FCI only. If you're selling a product, let's say a commercial off the shelf or COTS product, and that's all you do, and you sell a product like that to the DoD through the defense supply chain, chances are more than likely your contracts will not include CUI, only FCI, more than likely. But you have to check your contracts and clauses. Look in there. Specifically look for terms CUI, FCI, DFARS space 7012, or look for 7012. Do a search in your PDF or your Word documents. Look for those things, okay? Identify which level, FCI maturity level 1, applies to everybody. Everybody's at level 1. And then if you have store, process, or transmit CUI, level 2, maturity level 2 does apply to you, okay? Consider performing a readiness assessment. Use a qualified CMMC consultant. Make sure you're getting somebody who knows what they're doing, who has a compliance-driven mindset. Like I said before, not every IT company, and actually, frankly, most of them, they may dabble in this, may know a little bit, but they may have not done this before. It's new to a lot of us, right? So this really only started maybe within the last, let's say, 2 years, where it seriously started ramping up. We're seeing a lot more people coming into us today and asking for us to do a readiness assessment, or what's called a gap assessment. So document your system security plan. SSP is system security plan, which happens throughout the compliance journey, is what we call it. And your supplier performance risk system, SPRS, supplier performance risk system score. Out of 110, that's the max score you can get, what that looks like, whether you're level 1 or level 2. Then has to be documented and has to be supplied to the government. That information is critical for you to make sure either level 1 you self-attest, right? Or level 2, you have to get a third-party assessor. Second to last, you got a budget for remediation and certification, right? We talked about the average timeline. Didn't talk about that. So average timeline is on a highly accelerated timeline, 6 to 9 months. It'd be very fast. Hard to do. Most people, it takes them 9 to 18 months to implement this. So do you see my point about why it's important to get on this ASAP? Because once it's in contracts, you're already behind. You see my point? You're already behind the 8 ball, and that's going to be a huge disadvantage to you because now you have to catch up and you're going to be rushing through this. Don't be in that situation because you will lose opportunity and potentially existing contracts. So I would just recommend not doing that. Again, I'm not a defense contractor, so I can't put myself exactly in your position, but I can certainly see it from the outside and tell you what's going on, what's going to happen. So 9 months would be very aggressive. 12 to 18 months is a little more reasonable, working with your IT team, your security team, making sure that the process, policies, procedures all get rolled out, get created, get written, get documented, evidence collected, and they can actually sit for your certification. And then lastly, partner with the smart people, partner with the right people, right? Co-manage security, policy help, evidence collection, all that is critical and necessary step in order to be ready for your certification journey for maturity level 2, if you're protecting CUI. All right, last slide here. What can you do today? So I put a QR code up here to make it easy. Nearly everybody has a cell phone. Make sure that if you want to hit that, and it's going to go to our website. It's a very quick form. If you want to download our readiness checklist, feel free to do that. You can schedule a discovery call with a CMMC expert, whether it's myself, someone from my team, whether it's someone else who you already know, but make the step to move forward. If whatever I talked about today, all the material I talked about, if this resonates with you, you're like, oh my God, that is me, and I haven't done anything. Don't feel bad. There are a lot of people in that boat, but please don't wait. Do something and schedule a call with someone who knows what they're doing. Talk to your IT service provider, your managed service provider, about current technical controls, right? We talked about that 30%. It's only 30% talk about that, starting that process, right? You can do that concurrently in parallel with doing compliance work, right? We call it the compliance journey and the technical journey. Those can work side by side, all right? And start budgeting. Start putting some money aside, figure out, okay, where can I get the money for this? If you do have CUI, be 100 to 150. Again, that's ballparking, right? Depending on your maturity, your complexity, where you are in your journey today. Those are all relevant components. And so start estimating and start budgeting for that, right? Whether it's a line of credit, whether it's personally injecting cash in the business. If you want to stay in the space, getting started sooner than later is the way to go. And make a plan. What each assessor wants to see when they assess you for maturity level 2, they want to see a culture of cybersecurity that's preserved, maintained, and provable. If they don't see that, and they see systems or processes that are slapdash thrown together that cannot be proven or evidence displayed for these what are called 330, it's a lot, assessment objectives, you will fail your certification assessment. It will happen. Also be aware that your managed IT provider, if you outsource your IT, they have to be heavily involved in this because they're what's called a security protection asset. They're heavily involved in that audit, that assessment process. So make sure you're choosing smartly there as well. I know it's a lot. It's a ton. We reviewed a lot. And what I want to do now is go directly into questions. I'm going to go to the Q&A in just a second and see if we have any questions. But please put in the Q&A section of the webinar system. We'll answer as many as we can. We have another 20 minutes. So I appreciate you listening to me. I know it was like a long monologue. I hope it was valuable, but please feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. And I'll put my contact information up here as well. So we're going to go to the Q&A. All right. Bear with me for a hot second here.
Thank you, Mr. Gunther, for your presentation on how on Beyond the Basic Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Compliance for Small Businesses. We will now move into the question and answer portion of the presentation. Reminder to only use the Q&A panel to type your questions. Mr. Gunther, our first question is from John. John asks, is the VA going to require AE's NAICS code 541330 to comply with CMMC? If yes, what level? Understanding VA is not under DoD umbrella. What are examples of CUI associated with the design of VAMC and national cemeteries?
Okay, as I said before, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a contract specialist or contract officer. That's not what I do. What I would recommend you do is talk to your government attorney. If you have a government contracts attorney, have a conversation with them. If you don't have one, I'll be happy to connect you with one. But I can tell you this, if it's not a DoD specific contract, if it falls under the VA, and there's no FCI or CUI, certainly if it's not, again, a DoD specific contract falls under the VA, as far as I'm concerned, CMMC does not apply. If it's a VA contract, if it has anything to do with the defense supply chain with the DoD, then it is. That's the only delimiter I can give you. That's Mr. Bonham, John Bonham, yeah? Great drummer, by the way. He'll know what I mean. So I hope that answers your question, but we're talking about just DoD contracts, not VA contracts. Jessica, you want to take the next question?
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Our next question is from Benjamin. Benjamin asks, documentation from this past fall from the DoD outlines 15 controls for level 1. Is it 15 or the original 17? Also, how exactly do we define FCI in regards to contractors that work across various industries? Is this any and all information not publicly available in relation to a contract?
Okay, so several questions being posed here. So first of all, if you look at the FAR, there are 15 practices. If you look at this at CMMC, which is DFARS, there are 17. Depending on which one you look at, there's overlap between the two. I would err on the side of caution and go with the DFARS with its interpretation, and that's 17 practices. So just answer that piece of it. Secondly, bear with me here as this is being over, there's something popping over that question. So how do we define FCI in regards to contractors that work across various industries? This is any or all information not publicly available. Okay, so we define FCI in regards to contractors that work across various industries in such a way that if there is a contract that's either comes from the prime to you or you to the subcontractor, that is considered federal contract information. And that's got to be protected under what I will call the 17 practices for maturity level 1. Okay. I hope that answers the question, but that's about as far as I can go with that. So I hope that answers that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Our next question is from Mariah. Are there going to be contract modifications for current DoD contracts to add to CMMC?
Good question. Not that I'm aware of. So if they would have to make a sort of a mid-flight change, but I'm not aware, nor have I heard anything about that in the ecosystem. However, I'm not the arbiter of the answers, right? The arbiter of truth in regard to your contracts with your prime or with the DoD itself, depending on what level you're at. So my recommendation would be is asking your contracting officer or your contract administrator if it's upstream from you and have a conversation with them. I don't anticipate that happening, that they'll change that midstream. More than likely that contract with its existing clauses will run its course or hit the 5-year, 3-year, 5-year mark and hit the extension period by which there may be additional 1-year additions. But I'm not an expert in DoD contract work, just to be very clear. If you're not certain, again, I'm happy to make a connection to a DoD, to a GovCon attorney who does focus on that, can help with that. But a good place to start, again, is with your contracting officer or your contracts administrator in your firm or in the level above you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Our next question is from David. David asks, right now, the government can verify if a business has a NIST 800-171 assessment in the Supplier Performance Risk System, SPRS. Will the government be able to verify CMMC in SPRS or another site?
Yes, there is going to be, there's the SPUR system with supplier performance risk as David outlined here correctly. And so that score is currently listed in there. So the government will be able to verify CMMC in another system if it's maturity level 2, that's upon certification. It's called EMASS. Now, I don't remember what the acronym stands for. It's EMASS. The EMASS system is after successful maturity level 2, to be clear, 2 audit or certification, assessment certification, where you'll be listed there. And that's another DoD maintained and managed database, if you will. Okay. So that will be retrievable by the right people who have access to these systems to verify, particularly contract officers, right, within the DoD that are working at and awarding contracts and working under the context of the law and the regulation. They'll be able to look in there to find the answer to see whether you're certified. So the answer is yes, whether it's SPURS for level 1, but level 2 will find it under the EMASS platform.
Thank you.
Sure.
Our next question is from Whitney. Whitney asks, why would ML1 cost $20,000 to $30,000 for the self-assessment? Can you clarify the costs that are involved?
Sure. To be clear, this is a ballpark. The reason that we assign a cost to that is understanding and assuming, and again, you know what happens if you assume, right? You know the old joke, is that you may need some help with this. And I don't mean just from the technical implementation, because there's technical pieces that have to be incorporated for you to be able to say, we have these 17 practices in place, we've lifted up. So those will be projects in order to lift you up, whether it's rolling out MFA, password management, whether it's proper patching. Those things should generally be under most companies' IT and security management agendas anyway. They should already exist. But if they don't exist, those have to be implemented. Those are typically projects that have to be lifted up and then maintained. There's a cost associated with that. There may also be a need or a desire to get help with that maturity level 1 process, whether it's writing data flow diagrams, asset inventory sheets, and getting all those artifacts collected and properly filled out, and then submitting along with your SPUR score and with your system security plan into the SPUR system. That's why we assess a cost to it. I said though earlier, these are things you can often do yourself, especially if you only have FCI. And this may be a net zero to you. You may say, you know what, we have capabilities, we can accomplish and achieve all these things ourselves, and we don't need to bring in outside help for that, or we don't need to have projects. But it would be foolish for me to not give you at least some anchor of a cost. It doesn't mean you're going to spend all that, but we are seeing that folks are. When we help them, they're spending in that range.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Our next question is from David. David asks, from what you shared, this applies to all federal contractors at all levels. How do small emerging contractors who are either prime or small subcontractors comply with something that costs $20,000 or more? There have to be many subcontractors that cannot afford this. How will the government look to work with these small businesses to become compliant?
David, you're not going to like my answer. I indicated this a little bit before, and maybe that was right before you posed the question. I think you dropped in about 20 minutes ago. The reality is, it's not that the DoD doesn't care, but the DoD has drawn a line in the sand. And just to be clear, this is not all federal contractors, as you wrote. It's all DoD contractors, not federal, just Department of Defense, defense supply chain. I want to make that very clear. We're not talking about any other departments or agencies, just the DoD. Okay, that's one thing. So if you're working with the VA, with DHS, with other departments, other agencies in the government, we're not talking about those other departments or agencies. We're talking about the DoD. Separately, to your question about how can they expect the subcontractors to afford this, and this is where you're not going to like my answer. You have to be able to afford it at whatever level. You have to be compliant, and if you cannot, and that's just not possible financially, you have to make a business decision as to whether you're going to stay in this business or get out of it. You can't stay in it and not be compliant, because there's tremendous risk, personal and even legal risk, right? Criminal risk potentially if you do that. There's a part of the False Claims Act that was established right during the Civil War. The reason that was established, by the way, is because the U.S. Army had purchased a certain type of and quality of clothing for its let's say wool clothing for its for its fighters, if you will, for its soldiers. What I'm trying to say. And what happened was when that the clothing was delivered to those soldiers during the Civil War, and it was the North in this case, but when that product was delivered to the Army, it was substandard, it was poor quality, and effectively the U.S. Army felt it had been defrauded, but there was no law in the books to prevent this from happening. So that's why this law was created. It's from 1863. And that is still enforced today. So essentially, if the DoD or the government as a whole feels that it's been defrauded by a contractor with whom they do business, they'll bring a False Claims Act lawsuit against them. And that's not a good thing. If you lose that lawsuit, which is highly likely if they even bring charges, you're going to be likely having major issues there. And you would be barred from any work with the federal government, and you'd have to pay what's called treble damages. 3 times what you've been awarded would have to be paid in damages. And so it's not a good thing. So I hope that answers your question. What it doesn't answer is the plea for how do small businesses comply? The answer is there is no good answer. You have to comply, and you have to come up with the resources, however that is, to make this happen, right? Whether you do it as much on your own as you can and bring only the assessor, that's all well and good, but this is a very significant lift, and I hate to say it.
Thank you, Brian. Our
Sure.
next question is from Ray. Ray asks, currently going through CMMI to be completed by November 2025. Is there overlap of areas between CCMI and CMMC?
No, those are 2 totally different programs. One has nothing to do with the other. Foundationally, structurally, there's a relationship, but as far as what it's trying to assess and what it's trying to complete, the answer is no. CMMI was used as a platform when they created the framework for CMMC, but the deliverable and what's being assessed and done is completely different. So similar framework behind the scenes, but CMMI has nothing to do. It stands for capabilities model. It's capability model versus cybersecurity maturity, right? So CMMI has been around since the 80s and 90s. Very, very different from CMMC. Not the same thing.
Thank you, Brian.
Sure.
Our next question is from Jeff. Jeff asks, what dictates the maturity level a company has to achieve to support government contracts? How do I know whether I have to meet maturity level 1, 2, and or 3?
Excellent question, Jeff. So what dictates that is what your contract states. It's so important, I'll repeat it. What dictates that is what your contract says. What does your contract with the government or with your prime or with your upstream sub, what does that say? Okay. If it doesn't say anything, go back to your contracting officer or your contract administrator upstream from you and ask for clarification. Typically, there are two things. If you see the words stamped on a document that says CUI, controlled unclassified information, on any documents, whether it's 1 or 1,000,000, if that's coming in, you're storing, processing, process or transferring CUI related data or documents, it applies to you, even though your contract may not say it, which is why it's critical to get clarity from your contracting officer. Okay. But typically start with your contract, read through that, do a control F, do a search, look for DFARS, look for 7012, look for CUI, look for words like that. And one thing I want to make sure is that sometimes these things are not spelled out in clear language. Often they're included by reference. It's like maybe a short sentence or like a portion of a paragraph, and that refers to another piece of the DFARS regulation that is injected into your contract, and that's all they stick in there. But because it's included by reference, you're bound by that too. But start with your contract.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sure.
Our next question is from James. James asks, is CMMC only for DoD? Is CMMC coming to other departments like VA?
So currently only DoD. Is it coming to other departments like VA? There've been rumors for a while that DHS or other departments are looking at it. But if you think about the level of information that DoD and its contractors, the supply chain, have access to and use, from a national security perspective, you can understand why DoD would do this, right? Is that fair? I think it is. So, but no, it's only DoD right now. And until any other department raises its hand and says, you know what, we're going to use CMMC as well, they may edit it a little bit to achieve their objectives and their initiatives, but so far just DoD.
Thank you, Brian. Our next question is from Rod. Are you finding that your clients are charging these costs as allowable expenses to government contracts?
So far, we're not hearing that yet. And I don't know, again, we're not contract specialists. I don't know if that's allowable in your contract, if the increase in pricing is allowable to be charged back. Now, I had heard from, let's call it a semi-authoritative source a few months ago, that was not allowed, but there was a time during which it was. Let's assume you've been in business for 10 years, right? And you've been working since 2015, you started your company, you were maybe 1 or 2 people, now you're 20 or 30 people, right? You've grown. And let's assume at that point, you're like, okay, we need to look at this DFARS 7012 regulation to protect CUI. You knew about it, or maybe you didn't know about it, but regardless, you didn't do it. There was a time during which this was probably allowable that can be charged back, at least to a degree, to the DoD. I believe that door, from what I hear, that door is closed because it was long, it's been long been required, right? So it was really just lack of adherence to the regulation, and now saying, oh, now that's being enforced, who's going to pay for it, right? And so the DoD, from what we're hearing through the what's the best way to say this? The way that they're communicating this is, this has been out for a long time. You're already supposed to have done this. We have very little patience for those who didn't do it. They just ignored it. So it was probably, also, to be fair, maybe not a really good communication channel, right? Wasn't communicated clearly, but that's why the IG report came out and they said, oh crap, we got to build something better for this. But it was ignored. But the phrase, right? What is it? Ignorance of the law is no excuse. And that's not me saying that, but so I know that's not a great answer, but that's the best way for me to answer that. So I don't believe it's going to be paid for.
Thank you, Brian. We have time for 2 more questions. Our next question is from Eric. Eric asks, does a 3-year recertification require another full audit or just owner certification?
A 3-year certification, what's called triennial, excuse me, I just choked on my water. Triennial certification will require another full-blown certification by a certified third-party assessor, a C3PAO. And so every year you're gonna have to get reassessed. Now, the money I talked about earlier, again, the ballparking of getting assessed by a third party, if you have CUI, if you have to achieve maturity level 2, then that right now, that piece of it right now, this is at this current time, is going between $50,000 to $70,000. That's where the assessment price is pegged at right about now. Okay. To be clear, we don't do that part. We help the customer lead up to the assessment, and then we introduce them to 1 or 2 or 3 assessors from whom they can choose, right? Right now, that's about the price. We expect that to go up as more companies enter the ecosystem that need to be assessed, and there's not that many assessment companies. There are more being added all the time. Every week, a couple more flow in, but a lot of them need to be certified by the DIPCAC as well, by the Cybersecurity Assessment Center from the DoD. So there's a whole ecosystem that's being stood up right now. And so, yes, every 3 years, you have to pay for the assessment again. It's a triennial assessment, but it's an annual attestation by the owner of the company. And that's under penalty of perjury, just to clarify.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Gunther. Thanks again to our presenter today, Mr. Brian Gunther, CISSP and President of Exceed Cybersecurity and Compliance, for a very informative presentation and discussion. As a reminder, after today's event, we ask that you please complete a brief survey evaluating today's session. We also encourage you to continue to visit the VA OSDBU events page for upcoming programs that may be of interest to you and your network at www.vetbiz.va.gov/events. To everyone who has joined today's session, thank you on behalf of VA OSDBU and Strategic Outreach and Communications Program. This now concludes today's session.
Thank you.
End the session. Thank you all, ladies.
All right, bye.